Hi everyone. So this is the first in a series of 4 videos about equity investment terms aimed at founders of high growth tech businesses. And the first one's about liquidation preferences. So what is a liquidation preference? So if an investor has the benefit of a liquidation preference, it just means that on a liquidation event, and it's easiest to think about that as a sale, but it could be a winding up or any return of capital, the investor gets its money or a multiple of its money back before anyone else is paid out. That's all it is. But there are various types. So a 1 times liquidation preference just means that the investor gets an amount equal to its investment back before anyone else is paid out. A 2 times liquidation preference just means that the investor gets double its investment back. And then you come on to these phrases, participating and non-participating, which are really the key to this. So a participating preference means that the investor receives its preference first, and then it goes on to share pro rata in whatever's left over. So it participates in the remaining proceeds. If it's non-participating, that means that after the investor's received its preference amount, the remaining proceeds are shared amongst the other shareholders. Now, we won't get into the mechanics, but in practice, it'll be structured such that once you reach parity with the investor, so the investor gets its investment back, then the other shareholders catch up, and the rest is distributed pro rata. And the core principle, it really is that with a participating preference, it's going to operate so as to skew upside returns. And a non-participating preference is really going to work as a downside protection for an investor. The only way to really talk about that is by way of an example. So a table's going to pop up onto the screen in a second. And in our example here, you've got an investor that's invested £200,000 for 50% of the company. Obviously, these are silly numbers and rounded for ease. And it's going to look at how a 1 times participating preference and a 1 times non-participating preference are going to work in both an upside scenario, so a £1 million sale, that's a good result in our example, and a 200k sale, which is a downside result in our scenario. So firstly, if there's no liquidation preference at all, you've got 50-50 shareholdings, so you've got an even split of proceeds. Simple. Now, if we look at the downside scenario, so we're looking at the 200k sale column, the company's been sold for 200,000. The investor invested 200,000, so this is not a good outcome. Here, both a participating and a non-participating preference act to protect the investor. So the investor gets his £200,000 back, there's nothing left for the founders. More interesting if we look at the upside scenario. So here there's £1 million, so there's proceeds to go around. And you can see that if you look at the participating preference, you've got a skew in favor of the investor. So the first 200 of that million went to the investor, and that left you with 800,000 to be split pro rata, to be split 50-50 here. So the next 400 went to the investor and 400 to the founders. The upshot is, investor ends up with 600,000, founders 400,000. Whereas on the non-participating preference, you can see that the result is 500,000 for the investor, 500,000 for the founders. We won't go into the mechanic of how this works, but it's easy to think about it in this way. First 200,000 went to the investor, second 200,000 went to the founders until they reached parity, till they caught up, and then you had 600 grand to be split equally, and the result is even Stevens. So the takeaway from all this is not to say that a participating preference is never appropriate. You know, the economics of an investment may mean that it is. But if you're a founder and you have to give away a liquidation preference to an investor, which you may well do, what you really want is a 1 times non-participating liquidation preference. It provides downside protection for the investor, but it doesn't skew the upside returns. Thanks.